The world remembers him as the tough, gruff hero of countless films, the man whose voice could command a room and whose gaze could pierce through the bravest of hearts. But that evening, sitting alone in the dim glow of his Los Angeles home, the news flickering on the television screen made even him falter. It wasn't a story about the latest Hollywood scandal, nor a tragic accident on set. It was a revelation that shook the foundations of the industry he had spent decades navigating. Something unspeakable had happened, something that intertwined fame, betrayal, and secrecy, and as the words rolled over him, he felt the weight of history, of his own mortality, pressing down harder than any director's glare ever had. The world outside his window was alive with the usual hum of the city, neon lights reflecting in the quiet puddles from an earlier rain, but inside, a stillness had fallen over Ernest. He stared at the screen, gripping a cold glass of whiskey with knuckles white enough to betray the calm he normally projected. He had seen wars on screen, conflicts that tested the very essence of human courage, but nothing had prepared him for this. It was a story that involved people he had worked alongside, friends whose faces were etched in his memory: James Dean, Frank Sinatra, Shelley Winters. Names he had respected, even loved. And now, in one shocking cascade of truth, the illusion of Hollywood glamour had been stripped bare, revealing betrayal, greed, and a darkness that reached deeper than he ever imagined. For a moment, he could hear his own heartbeat in the silence, a painful, uneven rhythm that echoed the turmoil swelling inside him. The news anchor's voice felt distant, almost surreal, as if he were listening to someone else's life. But he knew the details were true. He had been there, in the corridors of that golden empire, feeling the whispers, seeing the secretary. Retive glances, knowing there were truths that could destroy lives if revealed. And now, decades later, the world was finally facing them, and he was forced to reckon with his own complicity, his own silence, a silence born of fear, of love, of loyalty, and perhaps, ultimately, regret. In that room, memories surfaced like ghosts. The harsh fluorescent lights of a film set where he had argued with a director over a scene that mattered more than it should have. The hospital rooms where friends had quietly slipped away from him, leaving words unspoken, confessions left unshared. And now, confronted with this story that none could ignore, he felt the sting of past mistakes, the weight of moments where courage could have altered outcomes but was instead swallowed by the relentless demands of survival in Hollywood. His family had called that morning. They had heard the news too, though from the safety of their homes, removed from the chaos that had defined Ernest's life. He knew he should speak with them, should try to explain, but the words wouldn't come. Each sentence felt like a betrayal, each confession a wound reopened. The pain of knowing that his own children, grandchildren, the ones who looked at him with awe and love, would see the cracks in the man they idolized, it was almost unbearable. And yet, in the quiet despair of that living room, he realized he couldn't hide anymore. The story had found him, and in some ways, it had always been waiting for him to face it. He took a deep breath, the weight of years pressing down as he allowed himself a rare, private moment of vulnerability. His voice, normally so steady, trembled as he whispered to no one in particular, "I've seen it all, but nothing prepares you for truth like this." A single tear traced the line of his jaw, a silent testament to the pain, the fear, and the lingering sense of guilt that had shadowed him for decades. Outside, the city moved on, unaware of the emotional collapse unfolding behind closed doors, of a Hollywood legend confronting a story that would leave him forever changed. The night stretched on, hours slipping into an uneasy quiet. He sat there, staring into the flickering light, wrestling with the memories and the implications of what he had just learned. And deep down, Ernest knew that by sunrise, nothing would feel the same, not his career, not his friends, not even himself. The truth had arrived, relentless and merciless, and for the first time in years, the man who had faced death, heartbreak, and betrayal on screen was forced to confront it in his own life. The morning light filtered weakly through the heavy curtains, casting long, trembling shadows across the room. Ernest Borgnine had not slept. The whiskey glass lay empty on the side table, a silent witness to the night's turmoil. He leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking under the weight of a lifetime, and remembered the first time he had understood the cost of fame. It was the set of Marty, the film that had brought him both acclaim and scrutiny. Back then, the world was simpler, or at least, he had believed it was. He remembered the nervous young actors, the whispers of jealousy, and the subtle manipulations that shaped careers. But even then, he had glimpsed the shadows that lurked beneath Hollywood's glittering surface, a darkness he had chosen to ignore. Now, decades later, that darkness had erupted into the light of public consciousness, dragging with it names that once seemed untouchable. He thought of Frank Sinatra, whose charm had always masked an iron will and a capacity for secrecy that few dared to confront. He thought of Shelley Winters, whose laughter had often filled rooms with warmth, but whose private battles he had only partially glimpsed. And he thought of James Dean, the tragic icon who had burned so brightly and so briefly, now posthumously entangled in the story that had shaken the world. Ernest's chest tightened as he realized how many lives intersected with this revelation, and how many were irrevocably changed by choices made in silence. The phone on the side table rang, its shrill tone jarring in the quiet apartment. He hesitated, then picked it up. It was his agent, voice trembling, offering condolences and updates, but Ernest could barely focus. The words felt hollow, drowned out by memories of colleagues, friends, and rivals, all living, all dead, all entangled in the web the news had exposed. "You have to speak," his agent insisted, "the public wants to hear from you. They want the truth." But Ernest knew that the truth was a dangerous thing, far more treacherous than the scripts he had memorized, more unforgiving than any director's critique. The truth had a way of cutting deeper than any performance ever could, and he had learned that lesson the hard way. He thought of the private moments, hidden from cameras, hidden from fans, the hospital visits where friends lay dying, their hands cold in his, eyes pleading for comfort that he sometimes couldn't give. He thought of family arguments stifled by pride, apologies swallowed because the moment had passed. He had carried secrets like stones in his pockets, weights that had bent his shoulders and clouded his nights. And now, confronted with this global revelation, those stones had become mountains. The walls he had built around himself seemed fragile, ready to crumble under the scrutiny of a world that demanded accountability, demanded confession. A knock at the door startled him. His daughter, hesitant, appeared in the frame. She had read the news, watched the frenzy online, and now faced the man she had always admired with awe, unsure if she could recognize him in his vulnerability. "Dad," she said softly, "are you okay?" He could only shake his head, his voice thick with the weight of everything he had bottled inside. I'm not sure," he admitted, the words tasting foreign on his tongue. He wanted to protect her from the storm, but he knew it was too late. The storm was already inside, tearing at the edges of his world. Hours passed with the two of them in silence, an uneasy truce of shared grief and unspoken fears. Ernest stared out the window, the city alive below, unaware that inside this apartment, a Hollywood legend was unraveling, confronting not just the shocking news, but the echoes of every compromise, every silence, every moment he had ever feared to confront. And in that quiet, he made a decision, a commitment whispered to himself. He would face this, even if it meant exposing every hidden truth, every regret, every painful secret that had defined his life. For in the end, he realized, nothing, no performance, no accolade, no legacy, was worth living with unspoken truths any longer. The day wore on like a slow, relentless tide, and the news cycle only grew louder. Headlines splashed across the internet and TV screens, each one a hammer striking at the fragile veneer Ernest had maintained for decades. Colleagues he had known since the golden age of Hollywood, some friends, some rivals, were being questioned, their reputations dissected under a global microscope. He remembered the nights spent on set with Clint Eastwood, sharing jokes and cigarettes between takes, and how even then, subtle tensions had simmered beneath the laughter. How little he had known, or how much he had chosen not to see. That selective blindness now felt like complicity. A knock at the door broke the haze of memories. It was his old friend, veteran actor Peter Falk, someone who had been through decades of Hollywood storms alongside him. Falk's eyes, normally twinkling with humor, were clouded with concern. He didn't offer easy reassurances, he didn't try to soften the blow. Instead, he handed Ernest a letter, its envelope worn and creased. "You should read this," Falk said quietly, and in that moment, Ernest realized it was a message from someone whose voice he had not heard in years, a confidant who had once warned him about the cost of silence in this business. He unfolded the paper, hand shaking, and the words on the page seemed to carry the weight of decades, confessions of mistakes, admissions of regret, acknowledgments of truths that had been buried to protect careers, reputations, and families. Some of the names were familiar, some had been erased from public memory, yet each sentence resonated with the pain and complexity he had long ignored. He felt a strange mixture of relief and terror, relief that he was not alone in knowing, and terror that the full scope of the secrets he had carried was finally coming to light. Hours bled into evening, and Ernest's body began to betray him. Years of onset injuries, late nights, and the relentless stress of Hollywood life left him weak, exhausted, trembling. He sat in the living room, the letter crumpled in his hands, and allowed himself a moment of despair. "Why did it have to be like this?" he whispered, voice hoarse, echoing in the empty apartment. Memories surged unbidden, nights when he had comforted young actors in pain, moments when he had chosen silence over confrontation, when loyalty had felt safer than truth. Each recollection now felt like a wound reopening, each decision a stone dropped into the deep well of regret. His mind wandered to family again, his children, grandchildren, the ones who had always seen him as larger than life. He feared that the story would taint their memories, that the legacy he had fought to protect would fracture under the weight of revelation. And yet, in that fear, a strange clarity emerged. If he continued to hide, if he continued to mask the truth behind the persona of Ernest Borgnine, he would betray not only himself but those he loved most. He realized that confronting the story, speaking his truths, would be a painful path, but perhaps the only way to preserve the fragile dignity that remained. Night fell, thick and suffocating, and Ernest moved to his desk. He began to write, not statements for the press, not defensive letters, but a private confession. Words poured onto the page, shaky at first, then with increasing urgency, as if decades of silence were being exorcised in ink. He wrote of regrets, of mistakes, of friendships lost and betrayals witnessed. He wrote of illness and loss, of the lonely nights when only shadows and memories kept him company. And through it all, there was an unspoken plea, a desire for understanding, for redemption in a world that had already passed judgment before he had spoken. As the pen stilled, exhaustion and relief mingled. Ernest sank back in his chair, staring at the letter, at the page filled with his own truth. For the first time in a long time, he felt something he had rarely allowed himself, the fragile, trembling possibility of peace. But it was fragile, and he knew that dawn would bring a new storm, questions, public scrutiny, and perhaps condemnation. And yet, he also knew that the silence that had protected him for so long could no longer shield him from himself. The reckoning had begun, and there was no turning back. The morning after, the apartment felt different, heavy with the residue of the night's confessions. Ernest moved slowly, each step deliberate, as if the weight of the past and the inevitability of exposure pressed down on him. He glanced at the letter he had written, folded neatly on the desk, knowing that it could change everything if it ever saw the light of day. But he was not ready, not yet. The story that had shocked the world had ignited something deeper within him, a confrontation with his own mortality, the mistakes he had long buried, and the fragile nature of trust in a world obsessed with fame and illusion. He thought of his own illness, the creeping reminders that his body was no longer the steel frame that had carried him across countless sets and battlefields on film. The arthritis in his hands, the lingering chest pains, the fatigue that me unbidden even after rest, all of it reminded him that time was no longer on his side. He had watched friends fall, sometimes too quickly, and he had felt the hollow absence of their laughter, their counsel, their shared understanding of a Hollywood world that few truly comprehended. And now, faced with this new story, he realized that the curtain of secrecy that had once seemed protective was dissolving before him, leaving raw, exposed truths in its wake. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. It was his longtime co-star, Ernest's friend and confidant Lee Marvin. Marvin's presence was a reminder of the golden days, of camaraderie forged under the glare of spotlights and the intensity of competition. But there was no warmth in Marvin's eyes now, only the recognition of the storm that had arrived, uninvited and merciless. "Ernie," Marvin said, voice low, "the world is watching. And they won't wait for you to catch your breath." Ernest swallowed, the lump in his throat making each word difficult. He knew Marvin was right. The story had a momentum of its own, unstoppable, and Ernest's legacy hung precariously in the balance. The afternoon bled into evening, and Ernest sat alone, replaying conversations he had once had in private offices and dressing rooms. He remembered the secrets shared with James Dean in fleeting moments between takes, the quiet warnings from Sinatra about whom to trust, the veiled confessions of Shelley Winters after long nights of drinking. Every recollection now felt like a thread in a tapestry that the world was tearing apart, each revelation threatening to unravel not only careers but friendships, families, and reputations. And yet, he felt a strange surge of courage. Perhaps this was his final act, not on screen, not in character, but as himself, stripped of pretense, stripped of defense. Late into the night, Ernest found himself wandering through the darkened hallways of his apartment, a silent observer to his own life. He paused by a framed photograph of him and his wife, a younger, vibrant version of himself smiling with a quiet joy that seemed almost alien now. The memories of shared laughter, of arguments softened by love, of the pain of watching illness and time take their toll on someone he had adored, these all came flooding back. He pressed his hand to the glass of the frame, as if reaching across time to reclaim what had been lost. And in that touch, there was both comfort and unbearable sorrow, a reminder that while fame fades, love, regret, and truth linger, unrelenting and inescapable. Finally, he sank into his chair, exhaustion and grief mingling in his chest. He whispered into the quiet room, "I've lived, I've loved, I've fought, and yet, I fear I failed where it mattered most." And in that whisper, there was an acknowledgement not just of the shocking story that had seized the world's attention, but of a life weighed down by choices, silence, and secrets, a life that had been as brilliant and tumultuous as the Hollywood sky itself. Outside, the city lights flickered, oblivious to the unraveling of a legend inside, a man confronting his truths, his regrets, and the possibility of redemption, or at least understanding, before it was too late.